So then the next category, after wrong and correct consciousness, and of course you can't really like wrong consciousness, correct consciousness, like these categories and the other categories, they overlap. It's not like the other categories are like totally different kind of awarenesses. No, it's like you can take any type of mind, any type of consciousness, and from the point of view of its main object, you can determine whether it's correct or wrong. So a very important distinction. I may argue that it's actually one of the most important distinctions, wrong and correct. And then the next distinction, and that is easy, is the category of sense and mental consciousness. Well, easy to understand, difficult to distinguish from your own experience. Very difficult to distinguish, to differentiate between... So, from your own experience, it is relatively easy to distinguish between a wrong and correct consciousness, I'd argue. Right? You just go back to the wrong consciousness, to the anger, etc., and then you check, does its main object exist or not? So that is relatively easy in terms of your own experience. Relatively, of course, depending on how wrong you are. But sense and mental consciousness, I think that is actually quite difficult to distinguish. Because as right now, all of you have right now a sense consciousness. In fact, you have 5 sense consciousnesses right now. You have an eye consciousness right now. There's an eye consciousness, a nose consciousness, an ear consciousness, a tongue consciousness, and a body consciousness. They're all there. When are they not there? Is there any time when they're not there?
Sleep.
Very good. When you're asleep. There's another time. When you're dying. Yes. Right, exactly. Or when you're fainting, when you're unconscious. Actually, the word unconscious is not correct, strictly speaking, because you're never unconscious. You're always conscious. There's a subtler mind then. When you say unconscious, it's actually meaning the coarser minds are not there. That's literally what it means. But it doesn't mean that there's no consciousness. Okay. Yes? Did you raise your hand? Or you did?
Yes. I just wanted to ask about when I'm asleep, so I still have like a sensations, right? So why we don't have a consciousness? Like just before you said about it, when we are asleep, we don't have some kind of body consciousness or like...
There's no body consciousness. When you're asleep, there's no body consciousness. There's no ear consciousness, no eye consciousness.
Okay. So I don't know kind of...
But your question should be, how can I wake up if someone pushes me?
Something like that.
Why do I wake up when the sun shines in my face?
Yeah.
Okay, very good question. But that is... Yeah. Or, to make it a degree harder, how can I dream about my alarm clock going off when it's actually there? When it's actually my alarm clock goes off and I'm thinking, oh, someone's making a funny noise. In my dream, I'm dreaming like someone is making this noise, beep, 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 like a bird, right? Like sometimes, how come if I don't have an ear consciousness, but in my dream, my alarm clock is perceived as being an annoying bird? Okay, now, this is a debate question, all right. But first of all, before we get to that, sense consciousness, while we're asleep, sense consciousnesses are not there. While we're awake, they're there, all the time. Now, right now, are you aware of your eye consciousness perceiving shape and color? Yes, absolutely. Are you aware of your ear consciousness hearing what I'm saying? Yeah, fortunately. How are you aware of your nose consciousness smelling something? Oh yeah, right now. Right? The moment I say, oh, are you aware of the smell around you? You go, okay. How are you aware of your tongue consciousness perceiving tastes? Yeah, right? Okay, if you just had a drink, you may be aware of the bitterness of the coffee or whatever. Okay, that's also there. How are you aware of your body consciousness, experiencing your buttocks on the... Oh yeah, now you are. Okay. So, which is interesting, because you can tell there are more dominant ones. Which one is more dominant?
Eyes.
Eyes, very good. eyes is the most dominant one. It's the most dominant one. This is why we have a tendency, we want to draw things. We want to make drawings even of radio waves and things that you can actually not even perceive with your senses, right? And still we do drawings of them. We even make drawings of them. We're so visually oriented. It's our main consciousness. Unless you're blind, that's different. But for a person who can see, it's the eye consciousness. It is so dominant that right now, it's very hard for you to become aware of your mental consciousness. But you're thinking the whole time, right? You're thinking about things, but it's very hard to distinguish between your eye consciousness, perceiving shapes and colors, and your mental consciousness thinking, oh, when is lunch, I wish the break was longer, or the break was short, whatever we're thinking right now, or I'm too cold, I'm too hot, etc. Okay, so therefore, from our own experience, to distinguish is very hard. The only thing you could do is, for instance, close your eyes. And then you become aware, because you're shutting out, well, the eye consciousness is still there. When you close your eyes and you're in a light room, you still have the appearance of some reddish, like reddish kind of light. It's not totally black. Why? Because your eye consciousness keeps perceiving things, but it's very boring. Don't perceive much. So then you become more aware of your mental consciousness, right? Okay. But they're actually all there, all 5 of them. All 5 of them are there. Okay. So just this much for you to know that it's just hard to distinguish between them. It's just difficult to distinguish between them. Because of the camera. If you could take... There's a... No, sorry. If you go behind here, then you walk in front. Yeah, perfect. All right. So, this much, I think we can all understand, that it's very hard to be aware we have 5, 6 consciousnesses at the same time. And then of our mental consciousness, we can have sometimes more than one mental consciousness, and they keep changing. There's anger, there's attachment, there's love, right? It's like, it almost seems like we have multiple personalities, because one moment we are so on top of it, and we're so spiritual, and a moment later we could beat up the person next to us, right? I know this because I speak from experience. It's not like I'm making it up. Of course, we all have this. We're very similar in that way. This is where the fun comes in. This is where it's really ridiculous and really funny how our mind can be so... And it's just because of imprints, of tendencies we've developed over years. They're positive tendencies, so we can be very spiritual. But don't get attached to the spiritual mind. Because, you can be as spiritual as it gets, and you meditate for like 10 whole minutes. And then another mind comes back up because we have other tendencies. So the problem is only when then we go, oh, I don't want to be like that, I'm very spiritual. Then you have another new anger arising, and it doesn't help. It's rather like a scientist. Oh, how interesting, there's this anger now. Let's get to know that. Okay? So to be more open and not judgmental about it. But getting back to this, so therefore our sense consciousnesses, they're neutral, basically. They're not angry, they're not this, they're not that. They just do their job, as in like eye consciousness perceiving shape and color, ear consciousness perceiving sound, etc. I don't even need to mention them, very obvious. Body consciousness is a little harder to understand because it pervades the entire body. Eye consciousness depends on the eyes, basically, whatever part of the brain that is responsible for it. Nose consciousness, of course, obvious also. It's very limited to the receptors in the body that are responsible for the smell. But body consciousness is all pervasive, inside and outside. That's why you have a stomach pain, because it's the body consciousness experiencing that internal pain. So this is all pervasive, the body consciousness. And it experiences, and it's not that dominant, but it still experiences heat and cold and roughness and wind and so forth. All right. Now, why do we want to distinguish this? Well, first of all, to understand that the sense consciousnesses are limited. We've already heard what we think the raw data that they provide us with. Well, it's just only a fraction of what is there. And also, what we perceive is not necessarily out there in terms of colors, etc., or sound waves. Actually, with regard, I haven't mentioned that, but with regard to beautiful music, right? If you listen to some music that you really like, classical or whatever music, it sounds so beautiful. It's actually just the result of pressure waves, right? Like particles basically moving in the air, and that movement, that vibration enters your ear, and then the eardrum experiences that vibration. I mean, when I speak, it's my vocal cord is vibrating, and pressure waves are created through the particles in the air, and that pressure with a certain frequency enters your ear ear, and then the eardrums. That vibrates, and then there's a signal sent to the brain. That's it, and we experience it as music.
There's a story behind the signals, and I mean, we react to all the levels of.
Yeah, we do, but my point is just what we perceive doesn't exist that way out there. It's not like there's like Mozart kind of flowing towards us, and that probably accounts for animals perceiving it differently because they may have a very different experience in that moment, right? But it seems as if there was that external thing that we perceive the way it is, but actually it's just many causes and conditions coming together that lead to that unique experience, and again, the object totally depends on a subjective experience. So the object is really just a subjective experience of different circumstances. That's what I'm trying to say. But it doesn't appear that way. It seems to be out there, and I just perceive it the way it exists. All right. But of all these different ones, of all the different senses, David, can you wait? Yeah. Of all the different senses, the different sense awarenesses, the mental consciousness is most important. The mental consciousness is actually also responsible for what we perceive with our senses. It seems like, no, our senses come first. And of course the senses, in one way, yes, we perceive a sense object and we start thinking about it. But through language and through the culture we grew up in, our sense perception is influenced. So there's first the culture we grew up in, the way we label things, the way we differentiate and categorize. That is all happening on the mental level. And then it gives rise to different sense perceptions. There's a great interchange between the two of them. So we don't have time to go into all this, but like just mentally, the way you feel mentally can have a great influence how you see things. And there's only extreme examples that describe that in a very effective way. There are less extreme examples which still work, where the mental consciousness has an effect on the sense consciousness. But to give you an extreme example, when you grieve, when you lose someone very close to you and you're terribly upset, food doesn't taste the same, the blue sky is not as blue, everything seems gray, right? So things that are like a massage that would ordinarily make you feel so good doesn't have the same effect. So your body consciousness hasn't changed. In a sense, like the sensation is still taking place, but because of your mental consciousness, the way it influences your sense perception, the quality has changed. It's not as vivid, etc. While if you're in love, if you're just in love, oh, even the monsoon clouds in Dharamsala, right? 3 months of fog and monsoon. Beautiful. Want more of that, right? We all know from our own experience. Okay. So, therefore, the point is that they interact, those two interact. But we need to understand them separately. David, what was your question?
Exactly on that point. I was wondering, do the sense consciousnesses apprehend the object? Do they know the object? Obviously, it appears to them, but do they actually...
Do they know their objects? There's debate on that. Yeah, they do. It's said that they do know their objects. Now, we have a sense in the West that it's only just something appearing to them and the mental consciousness interprets it. But actually the sense consciousnesses, at least they know the colors, the shapes, they know them. But the question, that's definitely in the scriptures, it's very clear on that. And this is said to be the explanation given by people who are able, through their own experience, to differentiate between the sense consciousness and the mental consciousness and to determine and say, yes, my eye consciousness knows this object. But you can take it a little bit further. Do you know that this is a table, or do you just know table? And there's some disagreement. Like saying this is, like knowing this is a table, versus just knowing the raw data, like shape and color. And so here there are different opinions on that, and I don't know which one to choose. And again, yeah, it's like different people have different views on that, right? So maybe it's different for different people, I don't know. Okay? Anyway, it's not that important why you know it, it's the mental consciousness or it's the sense consciousness. In the end, definitely what is for sure is that the sense consciousness have a certain quality, which is the object appears nakedly, right? It's not like you make it up. It's like with everything, of course, we've already heard, it's not really that phenomena exists the way they appear, but what appears fully, right? It appears fully with like different aspects that the mind needs to eventually go through, but it appears fully, it appears even with its changeable nature. Even the impermanence of the objects around us appear. Why? Why do they appear? Because the subtle particles that are constantly in movement, so they're never the same from moment to moment. So that movement is another word for change. In Tibetan, in fact, oftentimes the word for movement describes change. Because these particles, they're always in movement. They're the protons and the neurons, and they all appear to the mind, except we're not aware of it. And so even the subtle impermanence, that constant change, appears to our eye consciousness, but we cannot perceive it because the mental consciousness, its sense of permanence, influences our sense perception. So we're very limited in the fact that we cannot, for instance, perceive the impermanence of the objects around us because of the mental consciousness. And of course, phenomena also appear as if existing independently, again because of the mental consciousness. So we're limited because of our misperception, that the root misperception which comes from the mental consciousness. Okay, all right. So in the end, yeah, as far as I know, definitely the sense consciousness is no an object, but it is this, or it is a table, or it is not a table, that is debatable. All right. Okay. Now, the next step that is usually traditionally explained is now we come to causes. A cause for something. What gives rise to an awareness? So in this context, usually we then discuss the basic causes. There's so many causes, and one of you mentioned a cause before. You were the one like saying, because of the subconscious giving rise, but that's much more sophisticated. So just initially we start off with a very simple explanation. What are the causes that give rise to each awareness? Because they rise all the time. And at times the sense consciousnesses are not there. Okay. Now, very simple. There are three causes in terms of a sense consciousness. Three causes. Two are physical and one is not. And they're kind of interesting because they all serve a specific purpose. What is the well, usually they start off with not with the immediately preceding condition, but one of the three conditions, one of the three causes, they're described as conditions, but that's the same as saying it's a cause. So there are three causes, so three conditions that give rise to an eye consciousness. For instance, your eye consciousness perceiving this room, for instance. Okay, now that eye consciousness, it depends on a former moment of perception, a former moment of being aware. If a moment earlier you were not aware, you could not be aware right now. If you were not aware a moment earlier, you could not be aware right now. That fact, if you really understand that, what does that allow you to understand? Continuous of consciousness, that there was not a single moment in this life that could be said to be the first moment of awareness. You must have been aware before. Because you cannot be non-aware one moment, like not be aware of anything, and a moment later you become aware. That's impossible. So that accounts for past and future lives, actually. That fact. But to be debated, to be seen. But I tell you one thing. where I think we're so funny that we're actually not very consequent in terms of we're not consequent in terms of not accepting past and future life, because we kind of accept it and we kind of don't. In the sense that, while right now we all believe that my mind right now was preceded by a former moment of mind. We don't think, oh, my thoughts will improve if I eat more organic food. I mean, it's like you send your children to school, right? You don't give them organic food and hope that now suddenly they know math. That understanding that you send your kids to school and you don't feed them special math food shows that you actually don't believe that your brain is responsible for your math ability. You believe that training yourself in mathematics mentally gives rise to a knowledge of mathematics. Would you agree? Of course, good food is important and keeping your brain healthy is important, but you all believe that the way to come to knowledge is to learn about it, which shows you all instinctively believe that the mental consciousness that is knowledge must be preceded by the training in that knowledge. So we're all like that. So we basically all have a sense that our mental consciousness right now was preceded by another moment of mental consciousness, and another moment, and another moment, and another moment. So we're very consequent in that way, very consistent. Great. The only time we're not consistent is first moment of this life. Oh no, that comes from our parents. Now then it's different. All through our life, it is mainly a former moment of perception that gave rise to this. That is all true, except at the moment of conception. Oh no, then it's the brain. Bizarre. Isn't that bizarre? If you really think about it, all through our life, we go to school. We go to school because we believe it doesn't just come from the brain. But the first moment we do, isn't that bizarre? Actually, if you think about it, we're totally inconsistent. So actually, if that was true at the moment of perception, we don't have to send our children to school, right? Just find a way to get all this information in the brain, and then that creates the mind, right? Isn't that true? Would totally make sense. If that was possible at birth, why is it not possible? So no more high school, no more school. Not necessary, because you can get all the information through your brain.
From remembering, like remembering.
No, I mean, how do you learn?
In past lives.
Well, remembrance of past lives would be nice, but I don't even remember last month. So why do I expect to remember past lives? I don't remember when I was born. I don't remember when I was in my mother's womb. But there is a lady, apparently, who has photographic memory, and she remembers being in her womb. Yes. And there's children who remember past lives. I mean, come on, there are many of them. Right? And if you really, this is the best way to get a better understanding of past and future lives, because right now it just sounds like a story. Right? Like, oh yeah, you can just tell a child this, that, and the other, and they just tell you anything. But if you follow some of those researches, where people, very objectively, as objective as you can be, did research on that, you'll be surprised. I mean, there are children who have incredible memory of their previous lives. And what is it? What is this Druze boy that I just heard? Yeah, right? The boy who speaks perfect English? That was, you told me, Chaya told me.
It's like 30 minutes from here.
Oh, 30 minutes, let's go and see him. And then also, there's this other Druze story I remember of this boy who said he had been killed by some guy in a previous life. Yeah, the Druze believe in it, so they don't tell their children, your imaginary friend, and they don't listen to them. Like we do, we don't take it serious, and they stop talking about it, right? But they're encouraged by it, and so they keep talking about it. And so the story of this boy who said he was killed by this man, and he took the police to this person, basically, and then the person admitted to it. Anyway, the story is too long to tell you here. But it was in the news, I've been told, right? And I have a little niece, who once said, like, well, when I was a big person, I used to have a hairbrush like that. And her grandmother was like, don't talk like that. And I was like, tell me more. But I was also worried, like, I can't really take it to that degree. So I said to her, so when was that? And the grandmother was like, didn't like that, right? And I was like, well, tell me more. And she's like, oh, no, I don't really remember. And that was it. So she never talked about it. So she wasn't encouraged, not by her grandmother. She thought it was just making it up, and fair enough, I get that. But the thing is, like, there's so... Once you... And I had a hard time with past and future life, so I speak out of experience. But once you allow that possibility, and I usually say this to people, so you've heard me say that many times, there is a 50% chance there is reincarnation, and there's a 50% chance there isn't. Right? Either way, can't prove it right now. Not with our mind. We can't perceive it right now, so we can't prove it. It's like trying to prove blue to someone who's never seen, who's blind, right? We don't remember, so we can't prove it. But there's a lot of logic that totally supports that. So past and future recollection, but of course you need to go online and really go look at these videos of these case studies, and they're amazing, really amazing, and they're well researched. University of Virginia. There's a guy called Ian Stevenson. He's already passed away, but they continue with this research, and he's done a lot of research into this. And if you're interested, and you know why I'm telling you this? Because if there is future lives and you're not prepared, you're in trouble. Seriously, I'm saying this. I think it's so important, because if there is future lives, you can make preparations. I mean, come on. Do you have life insurance? Do you have a pension fund? Yes. So we're very good at preparing. But what if you continue living? Are you prepared for that? Right? And so my take on this is, if there's a win-win situation, if you consider that to be a possibility, it's a win-win situation. Okay? This I think is so important. Because if you take that as a possibility, that there's future lives and that your actions have consequences, both. Then if you die and there's nothing afterwards, at least you don't have regret. And you've been a good example to your children, right? Good example, and you've left a legacy. Great. Okay? And then you're gone and nothing. Okay. But you die without regret, and you die peacefully. Because of course you engage in actions according to karma. You don't do to others what you don't want to be done to yourself. So it can only be virtuous. Because you don't want to be abused, you don't want to be insulted, etc. Now, second scenario, if you don't, you die and you just go out of existence, all right. So even if you believed in future lives, you have a good death. Secondly, you go to heaven or hell or whatever, right? I don't even know whether in Judaism, do you talk of hell and heaven?
Yes.
Oh, both? Okay. All right, then you know where you're going. Right? Got the right ticket, first class. Because, you act according to the 10 Commandments, and so not stealing, not killing, etc. So you're safe again. And if your future lives, if they're future lives, you're well prepared. So it's so important. It's so important to allow that possibility. Okay. Now, going back to the mind, like I said, mind needs to be perceived by another mind. So this is the basic kind of idea that if you want to perceive something now, you can only do so if you perceive something a moment earlier, because that ability of perception was there a moment earlier. The mind can perceive things. Okay, so that's the first condition, the first cause for any consciousness. Yeah?
Can we create a kind of mind for something to come later? Like if you said the mind we have now is because something we had before.
Yes.
Can we create something?
Oh, can we create some? Yeah, knowing
the
something.
Next one will be.
So her question is, if in order to know now, something must have come before. Can we also create a resultant mind? Yes, of course we can, by knowing right now. Right? I mean, it's just a continuum that goes on and on. So this is why you meditate. Right? Why are we meditating right now on, for instance, mindfulness? Well, because we have a goal in mind, such as to be calmer when certain problems arise, to not be totally stressed out and taken away, but to have that awareness, that space in the mind. So basically we're actually based on that. That's why we meditate. Because I have a sense, not only does our mind come from a previous continuum, but we also understand it gives rise to a later continuum. So it's a kind of preparation for what is to come. In fact, in Buddhism, we don't care about past lives. We don't really care about past lives. The only reason we care about them is if there are past lives, there must be future lives. But there's no one interested in knowing who they... I mean, some people are interested, but I don't care. I was a frog, I was a cow, I was an Egyptian princess. It's gone.